This program is made possible in part by the Moving Image Trust Fund.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for being with us. Jonathan Meacham is a next-door neighbor, next door being Tennessee. Words have been his professional life. Former executive editor of Newsweek, now executive editor of Random House, and is the author of several books, including a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, another Tennessean. Most recently, his work includes Destiny and Power, a look at the life and political career of George H.W. Bush. Lecturing at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, Jonathan Meacham has made a little time for us. Mr. Meacham, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
One of the themes that you have tried to explore in your journalism, in your writing, is leadership, the nature of leadership, how it's cultivated, how it's identified, how it's cultivated, nourished. Right. What's the state of our leadership today?
It's been better. It's been better. You know, the key element in a democratic culture is what is it about an individual person that enables that person to get the rest of us to entrust our fates to him or her? What is that? That's the mystical transaction. And right now, interestingly, it's this very unconventional figure who seems to be doing the most to get the most attention. And you know, it's fascinating to have been writing a book about George Herbert Walker Bush is about as far away from this particular political climate as one can conceivably imagine.
You make the point about the book for a moment, and about Mr. Bush, you make the point that he was, if he was groomed for leadership, he was also groomed in a way, not necessarily to shut up, but not to promote himself. I mean,
the great I am, his mother called it.
Yes.
Don't say I am. He would come in and say I hit a double. She'd say, how did the team do? He'd say I was off my game when he played tennis. She would say you don't have a game. You know, it's remarkable. George H.W. Bush is the only modern president who never wrote his own memoir, never wrote a presidential memoir. He's been very much, for a politician, for someone who is in a first-person pronoun business, he has a great aversion to the first-person pronoun. You put that in context with Donald Trump, and it's a little bit of a reminder. We've gone from 25 years ago, we had a Republican president and a Republican nominee for re-election who could not talk about himself, to a Republican frontrunner who can talk about little else.
Does it surprise? What did you learn about Mr. Bush that you did not know? I mean, is there a side to him, an aspect of him, his style, or his personality that you really didn't grasp before you began your research?
There are two things. One was really how charismatic he can be. Personally, your native son, the 42nd president, can electrify arenas. Barack Obama can electrify arenas. George Bush can't do that. But if he were sitting right here, you would probably decide by the end of the conversation that you'd walk through fire for him. And that's how he became president. Person by person, transaction by transaction, assignment by assignment over a number of decades. And it was realizing that charisma that actually put me on the road to writing the book, because I wanted to explain what it was like really to have this 19th century figure seeking power and wielding it in the 20th century. Because he's really someone who has more in common with the founding fathers than he does with his own successors. The second is that he was a driven guy. He was a driven man. He admitted to that. He once said that, you know, what motivated him was goal. Always be the captain of the team, be number one. And it was an admission of ambition that was quite rare.
Is there any room anymore for 19th century people in the 21st century politics.
No, and there was barely room for a 19th century figure in the 20th century. It's the reason he was a one-term president. Politics was changing under his feet when Bill Clinton and Ross Perot came along. The rise of freelance partisanship, the rise of a kind of confessional, I feel your pain sort of politics. You know, Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall. It's safe to say that George Bush probably thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Andover. You know, it just wasn't his universe. It wasn't his time. And I think we've lost something because of that. There are moments where his skill set, his values, his ambient reality, which was public service, which was non-ideological, almost defiantly non-ideological. He told me several times, people always said about the vision thing. Well, what was wrong with just wanting to help people? I didn't have a vision. I didn't run for office to pass a flat tax. I didn't run for office to reunify Germany. I ran to make the world a little better. And that was how he saw the world. And we can complain about it. But from 1989 to 1993, momentous years, we were in very good hands.
He was superbly qualified, trained for the presidency by professional experience.
Arguably the most prepared person to ever become president. Secretary Clinton is pretty close. First Lady of Arkansas, First Lady of the United States, Senator, Secretary of State. George Bush was a congressman, ambassador to the UN, chairman of the Republican National Committee, ambassador to China, director of the CIA, vice president of the United States, president of the United States. Almost impossible to imagine him getting through a Republican primary today, where the word experience and establishment have become synonymous.
And anathema, almost.
Totally, totally. It's not surprising, frankly, that Governor Bush, that Jeb Bush, fell out as he did, because he has a lot in common with his father.
And you quote in the book, Mr. Bush 41 had some fairly tart things to say during the campaign and privately about the man who would become his successor. And we turn around and they're best buddies after about 18 months. I mean, what should we make of that? But
well, I think it speaks well.
I love Bill Clinton, was Barbara Bush's exclamation.
Right. I think it's not surprising on either level when you think about it. George H.W. Bush is a clubbable guy. He would much rather be on good terms with you than on poor terms. By my count, there are only 3 people with whom he's never reconciled. Ross Perot, John Connally, who's an old Texas rival, and Don Rumsfeld. Almost everyone else. In 6 decades of political life at the highest levels, he's basically ended up on good terms with. I think to some extent, like a lot of us, George H.W. Bush is entertained by President Clinton. And enjoys the shamelessness. President Bush will say,
kind of a vicarious sort of.
Well, it's what he says. Bill says there are 82 windmills in Nigeria. How the hell does he know there are 82 windmills in Nigeria? It's just the tsunami of facts and that sort of thing from President Clinton. I think engage Bush, and I think that it sends a good signal. That opponents can reconcile, and I think they both have the good of the country at heart. It was more of a journey for Bush to come to Clinton than Clinton to Bush because of the generational difference, the distinction. George H.W. Bush simply didn't believe that the country would turn to someone like Clinton in 1992. He later acknowledged he obviously was out of touch with that country, because it did.
Do you think Mr. Bush realized at the time, foresaw at the time, he was already suspect in the eyes of the right of his party?
Yeah.
And then after Read My Lips, well, we had the budget deal.
Right.
Do you think he fully understood at the time the depth of the reaction on the right?
He knew that the economy was going to be the most important issue. There are 2 moments where he was ahead of his advisors politically. Once in '88, he knew early on that Michael Dukakis would be highly vulnerable on an ideological attack to a "you're too liberal for America." That was long before Roger Ailes, long before Lee Atwater, long before Jim Baker came to him with that plan. He just knew it. The second thing is that he knew in March of 1991, nearly a year after the budget breaking of the pledge, and right after the Gulf War, that the numbers, his popularity numbers after the Gulf War, which were at 89, 90, 91%,
stratospheric, yeah,
were totally soft. He knew that the economy was going to be the issue, and he worried about that. And I think, personally, he lost his moorings to a large extent after the Gulf War, because I think at some level he had finished the work he was put on earth to do. There was no one better prepared in American history to put 35 nations together to execute that kind of military operation at a contentious, difficult moment at the end of the Cold War. And once that was done, he just had a very hard time re-engaging.
It's interesting in that Mr. Bush, having marshaled the forces of the world in the Kuwait situation, was the primary voice in saying, wait a minute, step back out when, with the Russians, with the fall of the Soviet Union, when it imploded. It was Mr. Bush who said, wait a minute, stand back, get out of the way, let them have some breathing room.
And a direct line between personal character and leadership, to go back to your very first question. When he was growing up, his nickname was Have Half, because when he had a candy bar, when he had a treat, he would cut it in half and give half of it to the other kid. His reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall, his reaction to the spinning off of the Soviet republics in 1991 was entirely connected to that. He was able to put himself in Gorbachev's shoes. How would he want to be treated? How would he want a victorious foe to act if he were in the losing position? And what, in the case of November 1989, he knew that having a triumphalist American reaction would anger the hardliners, might make it more difficult for Gorbachev to keep moving toward reform, to keep moving toward the end of the system. And so he put himself in the other guy's shoes. And one of the things, no matter whether you agree or disagree with George Bush, whether you think he was a rich, out-of-touch guy, whatever you want to think about him, no one can say that he was not among the most empathetic men to ever hold the office.
Empathetic.
He understood. If he were sitting right here, he would be worried about how you were feeling. Were you comfortable? And one of the great ironies of our political time is that a man who was born with what his brother once said, an innate empathy, was so politically handicapped in 1992 that he seemed out of touch and out of sympathy with the people he was leading.
A father loves his sons. The first president, Bush, is widely believed to have taken an exceptionally dim view of his son's foreign policy, particularly the decision to enter Iraq. And the Scowcroft, he said nothing publicly, but it was widely viewed that General Scowcroft was speaking for the elder Bush in advising against it. You don't want to do this. What did your research lead you to conclude?
That a lot of that is hyped. That I believe 41 was closer to 43 all the way through than even they knew, because they didn't talk about it very much. He wrote his son 2 letters about how this was the right decision. They had one consultation about it at Christmas 2002. I think that President Bush was not unlike a lot of Americans, which was early acceptance of the mission, understanding it should be done because of the predicate that had been laid. And then, as it turned out that we were in the middle of sectarian violence and there were no weapons, there were second thoughts, there were anxieties. As a friend of President Bush has told me, there were private anxieties that he put aside because he had to put his faith in his son's judgment. And one of the things that became convenient for opponents of the war, and ironic, was that a lot of people who had had no time for George Bush Sr. suddenly began to think of George Bush Sr. as Harry Truman compared to his son. And so I think in particular, 41, in interviews with me, a number of interviews, was critical of Vice President Cheney, was critical of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, was critical of his son to the extent that he thought that his son's rhetoric was too hot. When I took that to 43 said, well, you know, my rhetoric could get hot, but at least they understood me in Midland.
Right.
So he sort of copped to it. I think one of the hardest things for a lot of folks to understand, including me, is the lack of direct communication that actually unfolded between the father and the son about specifics of War and Peace during the term. A lot of us would think, you know, my God, you would talk to the last Republican president anyway, and if he's your father, you talk to him a lot. For a whole host of reasons, those conversations didn't take place.
Enumerate, if you would. I mean,
by and large. Well, I think that President Bush, 43, worried. He acknowledged this to me. He downplayed how much he did talk to his father, because he worried that people like me and you would think that he was overly dependent on the previous generation. He wanted to be, he wanted to be his own man. President Bush Sr. had been highly deferential by character and instinct to incumbent presidents, beginning with Johnson, running through Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. His view was that the duty of everyone who is not president is to make the president's life easier. If it was going to make his son's life easier to only be asked and not to volunteer opinions, that's what he was going to do.
Devil's advocate for a moment. If there's been a criticism of your Bush book, yeah, it's that I think one critic called it too sentimental, overly sentimental.
Sure.
Sentimental.
Sure.
Your take.
Yeah, it can be sentimental. I'll cop guilty, as George Bush would say. I believe I wrote it as true a book as I could. This is my view of this man and of what he meant. People want to disagree with it, God bless them. But I think that my job was to try to show what it was like to be this extraordinary human being who at the age of 20 was shot down over the Pacific. By the time he was 30, he'd lost a daughter to leukemia, held all the jobs we've talked about, was in power at the ultimate moment of the culmination of the Cold War. And I found him to be, by and large, a figure for whom the forces of light were more in control than the forces of darkness. That's not always true. Richard Nixon, someone like that, forces of darkness had a larger role to play. George H.W. Bush was not perfect, but his mistakes, I think, were those of a man were to be expected in someone who spent that much time at the highest levels of national politics.
You study America for a living.
Right.
We're in a very contentious age, to put it mildly. What do you say? We hear that voters on both sides of the spectrum, all sides of the spectrum, are angry.
Yep.
Well, no kidding. It's justified. To what extent is that justified? Taking the long pull of American history.
Long pull of America is that you have moments like this politically when one or the other of the parties fails to achieve a majority consensus on the central issue of the time. So the 1850s, you have the Whigs falling apart because they can't agree on slavery and the rise of the Republicans. The 1960s, you have the Democratic Party fundamentally changing as it moves from being the party of Jim Crow to being more left of center. Right now, what's happening, I think, in an issue as significant as race was in its time, is you have a Republican Party that is simply undecided and at sea to some extent about how to deal with globalization and its impact. How do you deal with a global trading world? How do you create an economy that's resilient in a world governed by free trade? How do you retrain people who need the retraining? How do you educate people on the front end?
Seems to be the animating impulse, and one of the animating impulses on the left as well. Senator Sanders making hay off trade agreements.
It is on trade agreements. But I will say this for both President Clinton and Secretary Clinton, they've both been able to articulate, since the 1990s, in to me, a very compelling way, what the trade-offs are, right? I mean, so he was one of the great educators in chief on the nature of globalization, the changing economy. The other thing that's going on, and I'm sure you've seen these numbers, if you look at the Pew numbers or the Gallup numbers in terms of trust in institutions, it's abysmal. It's just terrifying. I mean, it's
barely in double digits for Congress.
Congress is within the margin of error. You know, it's just remarkable. So you have these two things going on. You have economic unease and anxiety because of globalization, and you have, I think, a commensurate lack of faith in the institutions we've generally trusted to shape our affairs and govern them. And so what do people do? I don't think we should be surprised that they then turn to those who are speaking loudly and certainly in an era where so much is uncertain.
Uncertain as well to a great many people, and particularly in our native region.
Yeah.
The shift in attitudes elsewhere, anyway, toward, well, nationwide, toward intensely personal matters, sexual identity, gender identity, with the notable exceptions of, I guess, Indiana and North Dakota, the South, practically every state in the old Confederacy, and including, well, and Kentucky as well, and Missouri, are struggling with matters of sexuality and law.
Right.
Does this echo Brown, or the days of the years immediately following Brown?
Well, it is identity, and the politics of identity are always ferocious. I think to some extent, I have young children who I'm convinced will look at the fact that there was a huge amount of controversy over matters of sexual orientation and marriage equality. We'll look at that as if, well, why were you wasting your time on that? So I do think that it will be ferocious. We have always managed to find some way to fight over culture and identity, whether it was prohibition or abortion rights, school prayer, whatever cultural hotspot there is. Even if one begins to settle down, we find another one. And that's the nature of a democracy. Jefferson once said that differences of opinion were always going to convulse America in the way they'd convulsed Greece and Rome. You're going to have a different opinion, I'm going to have a different opinion. That's the point of the system. To my mind, the larger question is we need to get beyond my disagreeing with your opinion if you offer it simply because of who you are. That is, I should not be reflexively rejecting what you say because of who you are, because that forecloses my own ability to deal with data, to deal with reason. And what's happened in recent years is that because of redistricting, because of a kind of gated community mentality, is fewer and fewer people are allowing reason to dictate and to shape what they think. They hear someone on a network they don't like say something, and that becomes the enemy. Instead of saying, well, you know what, they may have a point there, I should try to incorporate what's good about that. Doesn't mean we have to agree. Doesn't mean the world is the Brookings Institution and we're all going to come and sit and reason together. But if I reflexively reject what you say simply because of who you are or what party you belong to, then I'm shortchanging the Republican experiment, lowercase r, which Jefferson and others realized was going to be driven by education and reason.
The Meachams had this wonderful life in New York. And a few years ago, you said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Let's go home. What was that? Back to Tennessee you went? Right. I mean, you still spend a fair amount of time in Manhattan.
Right.
But mostly it's Nashville,
Tennessee. That's right.
South toward home? Or
exactly. Good old Willie Morris. It was. My wife's from Mississippi. I grew up in Chattanooga, went to Sewanee. I spent a lot of time in Nashville when I was doing the Jackson book. And my 8-year-old son walked in to my little study in New York one Friday afternoon and said, there's nothing to do in a New York apartment at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And it was very hard to argue with him. So we looked at it, thought about it, and Fell in love with the first house we saw and moved. It's been 4 years. It's been great. It's been great. And we're very lucky that the work I do, I can do anywhere. And the kids have loved it. We have 3 little kids and 2 dogs, and I'm fighting a third. No, I think having a third dog means you need to register as a crazy person.
Not necessarily, but I mean, and the inevitable question, what's next?
What's next? Well, I'm toggling between, I want to do a book about Eisenhower at some point, because I think that was the last great moment of mid-century consensus, right? That's where you had a Republican president dealing with the Democratic Congress most of the time who got things done. And that's an interesting story to me. It's also interesting to me that if Eisenhower had died at the age of 40, not sure he would have gotten an obituary in the New York Times, right? And yet, 5 years later, he's the conqueror of Hitler. The other, even somewhat larger idea I'm thinking about is a joint life of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, and looking at the 2 rival courts as they fought the war. And I know I want to do these 2 books. In what order I do them is to be determined. But I first said I was going to decide by Ash Wednesday, missed that. Then Easter, missed that, so maybe by Ascension.
Whichever we anticipate.
That's right. Well, I
Jonathan Meacham, thanks very much for this time. Thank you.
Steve. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. See you next time.
This program is made possible in part by the Moving Image Trust Fund.